presentation, welcome to. No, that wasn't my anxiety-ridden introduction. That is an example of taking one language's syntax and throwing it into another language entirely. My name's Noah Hall, and as will become incredibly clear, I love Japanese. I'm a Japanese major, and I find translation incredibly interesting. Now, the reason I find it interesting, at least in regards to grammar, is specifically what happens with syntax. Japanese doesn't share any origins with English that we know of, and because of this, it has different restrictions as to what allows for sentences. So, jumping into it, sentence fragments. In standard English, all we need to make a sentence is subject and a predicate. I ran. Pretty simple. Standard Japanese, however, it's a little different. You require either a subject or a predicate. You can have both, but the standard is you only need one. Boku datta, hashita. These examples are I, it was me, and ran. So what's the problem here? Well, when you're creating a text or any form, if it's made in Japanese, the restrictions will be less. So translations become an issue. You have to add more or get rid of more. The book I decided to focus on for my corpus was Kizumonogatari by Nisi Oisin, translated by Ko Ransom. Now, the reason I chose this was because for a long time it was seen as unadaptable to film and untranslatable to the West. The issue is fixed now. There's movies, there's translations, I'm doing a report on one. The problem is, how did we get here? The reason people were saying that these things were unadaptable and untranslatable is specifically because Kizumonogatari and the Monogatari series as a whole is Nisi Oisin's very stylistic masterpiece, if you can call it. He has a very specific way of using dialogue and a specific way of using words and wordplay that is completely and entirely specific to the Japanese language. I think that the best authors use language as a medium, and he certainly does that. But how does that translate? Well, here's a basic example of what I mean with regards to sentence fragments. This is a basic structure for most of Nisi Oisin's writing. He'll introduce a topic and then use what we would define as sentence fragments to follow. Everything around her had been erased. Everything around her and behind her had been erased, just by being looked at, with just a single look. It follows a basic structure, an independent clause, followed by two sentence fragments. The number of sentence fragments can vary, it often does, but this is the basic structure. But what happens when this doesn't fit? You see, the moment that this is happening is a moment of thought. These are thoughts going on in the main character's head, and he's very pressed for time. He's looking around and observing very acutely. But what about a more relaxed scene? Well, this is where the translator starts to speak through with his own style. He decides to use dashes. Here's a basic example. In the original translation, he has, I told Hanakawa a story after that morning, and she listened in with interest, nodding. It's a fine sentence. It works. It's grammatically correct. But a more direct translation would be, I told the story up until that moment, and Hanakawa listened in with interest, nodding. It reads the same, but when you look at it on a page, it feels much more different. He decides to go for a more complete sense to allow the whole thought to flow. He wants to get you into the feeling of the characters, and this is in a very tense moment. At this point, he's just telling a story. So, and what are more examples? That isn't one example. There's many to go on in this, and this is just 5 examples within a 20-page area. And I picked these just to give you an idea of how many uses he can have for it. A lot of times it can be used, for example, just to make a page look nicer. 3 days later, April. Thanks, or rather, sorry. just gives it a different feel. The one I want to focus on, however, is the one in the top right. People like Oshino make me uncomfortable. People like you, I hate. Now, this is said by one of 3 monster hunters within the story. The one in the middle there. What makes him extremely interesting, in my opinion, is that he's the only one of the 3 that smiles. Well, they seem to be in it for money. He's here to have fun for his own purpose. So for this example, what I want to do is read a little of the Japanese just to give you a framework of what's happening here. Oshi no koi na hito ga suki ja nee zo. Omae no you na hito kedo hirai yo. Now, I love this whole little passage here. It's a perfect example of why Nisio Eisen breaks his sentences up so much. In this first sentence, he uses this right here, janezo. What that would be in standard Japanese would be janayo. But he uses a slang, and this isn't uncommon for him. He almost always talks in slang. But following that sentence, his next sentence is much more formal. In the first sentence, he had said, Oshino poi, people like Oshino. In the second one, he says, Omae no yona hito, which is people like you, only much more formal. And then ending with a very abrupt hirayo. Now, I can't say whether I like or dislike this translation. A more direct translation would have just been people like Oshino aren't likable, but people like you hate. But that's not the feel of what's happening in the scene. In the scene, he goes from being very playful to very serious by the end of it. And that's all conveyed through Japanese. So how can you capture that character? My attempt was, I'm not a fan of guys like Oshino, but for people like you, I hate. But that's just another interpretation. There isn't a correct translation. That's the problem. Where do we go? How do you get a correct translation? Well, I think that's kind of what makes Ko Ransom's writings translation so interesting. He decides to go for as direct as possible while being understandable and as grammatically correct as is fit. I think that honestly, with writing like this, the best way to do it is to go for a direct translation, but that's my opinion. I think that translations as a whole can be an amazing experience for someone reading it. I think that people can gain something from it, and that in doing so, you enlighten yourself on another culture just by reading their text. If it goes for a more liberal interpretation of what you're reading, your understanding of the culture will be lost. Sure, you may not go into it with much culture, but if you open your mind a little, try to get into it, you might learn something.